It has been 3 days. 3 days since anything significant entered your body by way of calories. You had some roots the morning of the first day. Stringy. Bitter. Not much nutritional value, but something. Yesterday you found a handful of berries on a shrub that was mostly picked clean, probably by birds who got there before you. Today, there has been nothing. The group has been moving, covering ground, following the signs of a herd that keeps staying just far enough ahead of you to be infuriating. Your body has opinions about all of this. Loud, insistent, physiologically creative opinions. The headache arrived on day 2 and has been a constant companion since. Your concentration has a quality to it that you might describe as fractured. You can maintain focus on any one thing for a period, but the edges of your attention keep fraying, pulling toward nothing in particular, like a signal losing strength. Your legs feel functional, but not enthusiastic. Your temper, usually something you manage with reasonable competence, is sitting much closer to the surface than normal. And you are cold. Not because the temperature has dropped significantly, the afternoon is actually mild. But hunger and cold are connected in ways your body understands even if you don't have the vocabulary for it. Without adequate calories, maintaining core temperature becomes a project rather than an automatic background function. You are burning through your reserves. The reserves are finite. You keep moving. This is the ancient hunger experience. Not the romantic intermittent fasting, choosing to skip lunch hunger of a modern person with a full refrigerator at home. The real thing. The hunger that defined the parameters of ancient human life in ways so fundamental that our bodies, our cognition, our social structures, and our relationship with food all bear its evolutionary fingerprints to this day. So how did ancient humans deal with it? Not philosophically, not the existential question of what hunger meant to them, though that is interesting too. Practically, physically. What did they do? What did they know? What strategies did they employ? And how did they survive periods of genuine food scarcity that would send a modern person directly to the emergency room? The answer is a masterclass in biological adaptation, behavioral sophistication, and communal resilience that most people have never thought carefully about. Let's change that. Let's start with the physiology, because ancient humans' ability to survive hunger was not just a matter of willpower or strategy. Their bodies were built for it. The human body's response to food scarcity is one of the most sophisticated and elaborate physiological systems in our biology. And it is ancient, developed over millions of years of evolutionary pressure in an environment where food availability was variable, unpredictable, and sometimes catastrophically insufficient. Understanding this system is essential for understanding how ancient humans survived what would be, by modern standards, alarming periods without adequate nutrition. The first response to reduced caloric intake is metabolic downregulation. The body does not simply maintain its normal energy expenditure and drain its reserves linearly. It adjusts. The basal metabolic rate, the baseline energy burn that keeps you alive and functional while doing nothing, drops in response to restricted caloric intake. Not dramatically in the short term, but measurably. The body is doing the calculation. Less coming in means less going out. It reduces non-essential energy expenditures, prioritizing the functions that matter most for immediate survival. The second response is fuel switching. Under normal, well-fed conditions, the brain and most body tissues run primarily on glucose, the simple sugar derived from carbohydrate digestion. When dietary carbohydrates are absent or insufficient, the liver begins converting fat stores into ketone bodies, which the brain can use as an alternative fuel. This metabolic state, ketosis, is what allows humans to function cognitively during extended periods without carbohydrate-rich foods. It is not a crisis state. It is a designed alternative fuel pathway deployed automatically when needed. Ancient humans spent significant portions of their lives in some degree of ketosis. The carbohydrate-rich foods that dominate modern diets, grains, cultivated fruits, processed foods, were largely unavailable in the ancient world. The primary macronutrient in ancient diets was fat from animal sources, supplemented by protein and whatever carbohydrates were available seasonally from plant foods. This diet naturally produced a metabolic state that was much closer to modern ketosis than to the glucose-dominant metabolism of modern carbohydrate-heavy diets. Ancient humans were metabolically adapted to running on fat, and their brains were specifically adapted to function well in the ketotic state. This is not a minor point. It means that what modern people experience as the cognitive impairment of hunger, the brain fog, the difficulty concentrating, the irritability, is partly a symptom of a modern metabolic baseline encountering a situation it is not adapted for. Ancient humans running on a fat-adapted metabolism experienced hunger differently, not painlessly, not without the headache and the fatigue and the irritability, but with a metabolic architecture that handled the transition to fat-burning fuel smoothly, without the sharp cognitive cliff that modern high-carbohydrate eaters fall off when food is withheld. Let's talk about fat storage, because this is where human biology diverges most interestingly from our primate relatives in ways directly relevant to hunger survival. Humans are, by primate standards, unusually fat. Not obese, that is a modern pathology. But naturally, in their baseline healthy state, humans carry a significantly higher proportion of body fat than chimpanzees, bonobos, or gorillas of equivalent body mass. Adult humans in traditional societies without access to processed foods and with high levels of physical activity still carry approximately 10 to 20% body fat compared to the roughly 3 to 8% typical of other great apes. This extra fat is not accidental. It is an evolutionary adaptation to an environment of variable food availability. Body fat is stored energy, a reserve that can be mobilized when dietary energy is insufficient to meet metabolic demands. Each kilogram of body fat stores approximately 7,700 kilocalories of energy. A typical ancient adult human carrying 10 to 15 kilograms of body fat, lean by modern standards, had a caloric reserve of approximately 77,000 to 115,000 kilocalories available in their adipose tissue. At a baseline metabolic rate of approximately 1,500 to 2,000 kilocalories per day, this represents roughly 40 to 75 days of metabolic reserves, even without any dietary intake whatsoever. Ancient humans were literally built to survive extended food scarcity. Their fat stores were the biological insurance policy that evolution had provided against the inevitable periods of dietary insufficiency that characterized ancient life. The specific distribution of fat in humans, subcutaneous fat distributed across the body rather than concentrated in visceral depots the way it is in other primates, is also specifically suited to endurance in cold environments, providing thermal insulation alongside caloric reserve. The autumn fattening strategy, the specific behavioral pattern of deliberately consuming high-calorie, fat-rich foods in autumn to build reserves for winter, was almost certainly a conscious, deliberate strategy in ancient northern latitude populations, not just a behavioral response to seasonal food availability. Ancient humans who lived through enough winters understood, empirically if not theoretically, that entering winter with maximum fat reserves improved their chances of surviving it. Now let's talk about the behavioral strategies, because physiology alone does not explain how ancient humans managed hunger. The behavioral layer is equally important and considerably more interesting. The first and most fundamental behavioral strategy is range expansion. When food becomes scarce in one location, you move to find it somewhere else. Mobile hunter-gatherers have home ranges, territories they know well, move through regularly, and have mapped cognitively in extraordinary detail over years of habitation. But when food within the normal range fails, the response is to expand beyond it, moving into less familiar territory in search of resources that are unavailable at home. This strategy required navigational knowledge, risk assessment, and social coordination. Entering unfamiliar territory meant encountering unknown predator landscapes, unknown water sources, unknown hazards, and potentially the territories of other human groups whose response to trespass was unpredictable. The decision to expand range during food scarcity was not a casual one. It required balancing the certain cost of continued food scarcity against the uncertain risk of unfamiliar territory. The groups that managed this calculation most effectively. that had the broadest geographical knowledge, the most flexible willingness to move, and the strongest social networks that could vouch for safe passage through neighboring territories, survived food scarcity better than those that stayed rigidly within familiar ranges when those ranges failed. This is one reason why the long-distance social networks that ancient humans maintained, connections with distant groups through trade, intermarriage, and periodic large gatherings, were survival-critical infrastructure rather than social luxury. When your local territory fails, you need to be able to call on relationships in other territories. Ancient humans invested in those relationships during times of plenty because they knew, through generations of accumulated experience, that times of scarcity would come and that those relationships would be what stood between survival and starvation. Let's talk about food knowledge, because this is the dimension of ancient hunger management that is most consistently underappreciated and most genuinely extraordinary. Ancient humans knew their food environments in a depth and breadth that modern humans have almost entirely lost. The ethnobotanical knowledge documented in contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, the detailed knowledge of which plant species are edible, how to prepare them to reduce toxicity or improve palatability, at what stage of development they are most nutritious, where specific species are found in the landscape, what other plants they grow near, what seasonal cues indicate their availability, represents an accumulated knowledge base of staggering richness. The Yash Kung San of the Kalahari have documented knowledge of approximately 150 edible plant species in their range, including detailed knowledge of which are available in which seasons, which parts are edible, and how preparation affects their nutritional and palatability properties. The Hadza of Tanzania have comparable knowledge depth. These knowledge bases are the products of thousands of years of accumulated observation and experimentation, transmitted across generations, and they represent the difference between a landscape that looks like it has nothing and a landscape that turns out to have food available to those who know where and how to look. This matters enormously for hunger management. A person with shallow food knowledge entering a landscape during a lean period sees scarcity. A person with deep food knowledge entering the same landscape sees options. Not good options, not the preferred calorie-dense foods of a successful hunting season, but options, fallback foods, emergency provisions, plants that are available year-round rather than seasonally, insects and small animals that are present even when large game is absent, underground storage organs, roots, tubers, corms that are available even when above-ground plant parts have died back. The knowledge of fallback foods was survival-critical knowledge. It was the bottom layer of the ancient food knowledge system, the options you turned to when everything else had failed. And ancient humans maintained and transmitted this knowledge with the same care they brought to their knowledge of preferred foods, precisely because they understood that the time when you would need it was exactly the time when you would be least able to learn it from scratch. Let's get specific about what those fallback foods actually were, because the specificity matters. Underground storage organs, the roots, tubers, bulbs, and corms of various plant species are among the most reliable fallback foods available to ancient humans in most inhabited landscapes. They are available in winter when above-ground plant material has died back. They are calorie-dense relative to most above-ground plant parts. They require knowledge and effort to access. Digging tools. Knowledge of which species have edible underground parts, understanding of preparation requirements, but they are present in the landscape year-round in a way that most other plant foods are not. The ancient technology of digging sticks, simple tools used to excavate underground plant parts, is among the most ancient tool technologies we have evidence for, going back hundreds of thousands of years. Digging sticks do not preserve well in the archaeological record, but the residue evidence of underground plant processing at ancient sites, and the anatomical evidence of the specific hand and arm muscle development patterns associated with digging in ancient skeletal remains, tell us that underground plant food exploitation was a consistent, major component of ancient diets, not a rare emergency fallback. Insects are another critical fallback food that ancient humans almost certainly used during lean periods. Insects are high in protein and fat, available in most landscapes in significant quantities, and require no hunting skill or weapons to collect. Their use as fallback foods is documented across virtually every traditional society that has been studied in environments where insects are present. The nutritional value of insects is substantial. Some species provide more protein per unit weight than beef, and their availability is often inversely correlated with large game availability, meaning that they are most accessible precisely in the landscape conditions when other protein sources are scarce. Bone marrow deserves specific mention because it represents a nutritional resource that ancient humans exploited with sophisticated efficiency. When a large animal carcass was available, whether from a successful hunt, a scavenged kill, or a natural death, the marrow inside the long bones represented a dense, calorie-rich fat source that persisted long after the muscle meat had been consumed or had spoiled. Ancient humans cracked bones deliberately and systematically to extract marrow, a behavior documented at ancient sites going back hundreds of thousands of years. During lean periods when fresh food was scarce, returning to cached or scavenged bone material and extracting residual marrow was a meaningful caloric supplement. Let's talk about food storage, because this is the behavioral strategy that most directly addressed the fundamental challenge of temporal mismatch between food availability and food need. The problem of hunger in the ancient world was often not that food was permanently unavailable in a landscape, but that it was available in abundance at some times and unavailable at others. Seasonal variation, the boom and bust cycles of animal populations, the unpredictable timing of plant fruiting and root development. The solution to temporal mismatch is storage, capturing surplus from periods of abundance and preserving it for periods of scarcity. Ancient humans developed food storage technologies that are more sophisticated than most people realize. Drying is the most universal. Meat and plant foods dried in sun and wind lose moisture rapidly, which inhibits the microbial and enzymatic processes that cause spoilage. Dried meat, fish, and plant materials can be stored for months or even years under the right conditions. Smoking accelerates drying, adds antimicrobial compounds from the smoke, and produces flavors that may have been valued independently of their preservation function. Both drying and smoking are documented at ancient archaeological sites going back tens of thousands of years in the form of specific tool marks on animal bones consistent with meat preparation for drying, and in the evidence of smoking structures at ancient camps. Fermentation is another ancient preservation technology with direct relevance to hunger management. Fermented foods, whether intentionally fermented or naturally fermented through controlled exposure to specific microbial environments, have extended shelf lives compared to fresh foods, and often have increased or transformed nutritional profiles. The evidence for intentional fermentation in the ancient period is indirect but consistent with a technology that was discovered and exploited early. Naturally fermented plant materials, fruits that have begun to ferment before consumption, roots processed in ways that induce fermentation, are documented in ancient food residue analysis. Fat rendering and storage represents a specific and underappreciated ancient food preservation strategy. Animal fat rendered from fresh carcasses and stored in hide or bone containers maintains caloric value for extended periods, particularly in cold climate conditions where the ambient temperature serves as a natural refrigerant. Ancient cold climate communities almost certainly rendered and stored large quantities of fat from autumn kills, specifically as a caloric reserve for the winter months. The fat lamp technology of ancient cold climate peoples, which burned rendered animal fat for light and heat, also functioned as a caloric reserve that could be consumed if the food situation became desperate enough. Let's talk about the social dimension of hunger management, because this is the layer that ties everything else together and represents ancient humans' most sophisticated response to food scarcity. In small, interdependent ancient communities, food distribution norms were not optional social courtesies. They were survival infrastructure. The sharing of food across community members, particularly the sharing of large game that could not be consumed by the hunting party before it spoiled, was governed by norms that were as binding and as seriously enforced as any other community rule. These sharing norms served a specific and important function. They converted the temporally and individually variable success of hunting into a reliable communal food supply. Any individual hunter experiences significant variance in their hunting success from day to day and week to week. On some days you get something. On many days you get nothing. But across a community of hunters all sharing their kills, the variance averages out. The days when you bring in a successful kill feed, the days when you bring in nothing, through the mechanism of reciprocal sharing that ensures that your successful days benefit the community and the community's successful days benefit you. This is risk pooling. It is the same principle that underlies insurance, converting individual risk into shared risk through collective participation. Ancient food sharing was not charity. It was rational risk management in a world where individual hunting variance was high and individual food failure was potentially fatal. The social norms that governed food sharing in ancient communities, who shared with whom, how much, under what circumstances, with what expectations of reciprocity, were among the most carefully maintained and most seriously enforced norms in ancient social life. Free riding, taking food during lean times without contributing during good times, was one of the most serious social violations possible because it undermined the risk pooling system that everyone depended on. The long-distance social networks that ancient humans maintained with other groups were an extension of this same principle at a larger scale. When your local group's food supply failed catastrophically, when a drought or a disease devastated the local prey population, the ability to call on relationships with distant groups for emergency food sharing was the difference between surviving and not. Ancient humans maintained these distant relationships through gift exchange, intermarriage, and periodic large gatherings precisely because they were the survival net that their local sharing network could not provide. Let's address the psychological dimension of ancient hunger, because it is both fascinating and directly connected to modern human psychology in ways that most people have never considered. Hunger is not just a physical state, it is a psychological and cognitive state with specific effects on attention, motivation, decision-making, and emotional regulation. The psychology of hunger evolved in the context of ancient human life, shaped by millions of years of selection pressure in an environment where food was variably available and where the behavioral response to scarcity could determine survival. The specific cognitive effects of hunger, the narrowing of attention toward food-related stimuli, the enhancement of certain types of environmental scanning, the increased risk tolerance in situations where food acquisition is the goal, are all adaptive responses in an ancient context. A hungry ancient human who focused intensely on food finding, who scanned the environment with heightened attention for signs of prey or edible plants, who was willing to take risks to find food that a well-fed individual would decline, that individual was more likely to find food and survive scarcity than one whose cognitive response to hunger was simply passivity. The irritability and social friction that hunger produces is also, paradoxically, potentially adaptive. A hungry community is a community under genuine stress and some degree of urgency and edge in social interactions during food. Scarcity may have served a signaling function, communicating the reality of the situation to all community members and motivating collective action for food acquisition rather than continued rest or social activity. Ancient humans developed culturally transmitted strategies for managing the psychological effects of hunger as well as its physical ones. The practice of telling stories, singing, and engaging in intense social activity during lean periods, documented in multiple traditional societies, served as psychological management of the hunger experience, occupying the mind with engaging content and maintaining social cohesion precisely when the stress of scarcity was most likely to produce destructive social conflict. Here is something that connects all of this to the present in a way that I think is worth sitting with. Every physiological and behavioral adaptation to hunger that we have discussed, the metabolic flexibility, the fat reserves, the fallback food knowledge, the sharing norms, the long-distance social networks, the psychological responses to food scarcity, is still present in modern humans, not as vestigial relics. As fully functional systems operating in modern bodies and modern psychologies shaped by millions of years of selection pressure in ancient environments. The modern food environment, with its reliable abundance, its caloric density, its year-round availability of every food type regardless of season, is genuinely novel in the history of our species. It is an environment that our ancient adaptations were not designed for. The fat storage systems that kept ancient humans alive through famines are still operating, accumulating reserves against scarcities that never come. The hunger psychology that motivated urgent food seeking in ancient lean times is still running, creating the specific relationship with food that modern people experience in an environment of surplus. The preference for calorie dense, fat rich, sweet foods, the preference that was adaptive in a world where such foods were rare and precious, is still there, encountering a world where those foods are available in unlimited quantities at negligible cost. The ancient hunger adaptations are not problems with modern humans. They are solutions to problems that no longer exist in the same form, operating in a context that has changed faster than evolution can track. Ancient humans who faced genuine hunger 3 days into a failed hunt, the person we started with, moving through a landscape that was not providing, were not running systems that were poorly designed or inadequate. They were running exactly the systems that millions of years of selection had refined for exactly this situation. The metabolic flexibility, the fat reserves, the encyclopedic food knowledge, the social networks, the cognitive urgency, all of it was there, running, managing the situation with a sophistication that no technology of equivalent complexity has ever been deliberately engineered to match. They kept moving, and eventually they ate.